Hello, Matthew Griffin here today, and today I'd like to talk about Malik Davis and his nonviolent protest from earlier this year. Malik Davis is a 25-year-old philosophy student living in Greensboro, North Carolina. On June 1st, 2020, Davis protested against racial injustice and the city curfew by sitting on the Nathaniel Greene statue in downtown Greensboro for several hours. Later that night, he was arrested on charge of violating said curfew and was charged a fine of $500. While this act of protest was not the only one that night, it went viral among local news sources and Facebook Live, so an audience was definitely present to receive a message. But what was Davis's message? According to him, quote-unquote, "This is a revolution. The time for all this is over," end quote. Davis's action of being present, though simple, was effective in protesting racial inequality and free speech. This was done through its nonviolent characteristics, uniqueness, and aftermath. Davis was clearly aware of the power of nonviolent protests. After all, many figures from across the world, such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela, just showed how powerful nonviolence is when it comes to activism. But in Greensboro, nonviolent protest has a bit of a more important history. In 1964, African-American men bolstered the civil rights movement in North Carolina by sitting at the whites-only lunch counter at the F.W. Woolworth Company in North Carolina and Greensboro. Through nonviolence, more and more people joined in to denounce segregation in their local community. These sit-ins are now revered as a very important part of the civil rights movement in America, as it was able to spark more similar protests. Davis took that same spirit into his protests as well. By refusing to stay violent, he was able to gain ethos by staying above it, and gain pathos by basically drudging up memories of other famous protests in the past. Considering how the curfew he is protesting was meant for violent protests specifically, he manages to show the exigence of it just by being the odd one out. Speaking of that, the way that he also presented himself was also very important to note. In order to draw in pathos while criticizing American values, the words "the Constitution" were printed across his chest. And that, paired with the act of sitting on Nathaniel Greene, who was a Revolutionary War general, he shows the hypocrisies of America's values in the midst of racial injustice. In an interview with Triad City Beat, he states that, quote, "In this country, it seems that the Constitution doesn't mean anything for African Americans or people of color or minorities. We don't have any of the same liberties or civil rights." This is justified considering the terrible acts of violence committed against African Americans in this year alone. By embracing himself in this idea of freedom that the Constitution says it supports, i.e., all men are created equal, given unalienable rights, etc., he showed how America says it supports the idea of equality while turning its back on the unavoidable racism in its systems and practice. And judging by the aftermath that came after that, it only proved that very point. When the police found him on the statue, they didn't immediately arrest him or commit any sort of acts of violence against him. In fact, they tried to convince him to come down, but he refused, saying that he would be up there all night. However, in a published video, the aggression of the officers to get him to comply was very obvious. Despite not resisting, you could see the officers forcefully grabbing him and shouting at him with a lot of aggression. His cooperation to not retaliate really shows his authority and ethos in this situation. Furthermore, if he was not arrested, then it would have been a whole nother injustice not being showcased. According to the article mentioned earlier, there were 2 other people arrested alongside him that night. And Davis got the most expensive fine out of all of them for $500, while the white man got $100 and the Asian man got $300. Overall, his actions showed how the American justice system is biased against African Americans, all just for sitting down a little bit late after curfew. Davis's simple act of protest was a result of many that came before him, and may be a cause for many other similar protests to happen in the future. The best way to solve these kinds of issues are honestly with nonviolence and with conversation. So, thank you and have a good day.